Hi, everyone. My name's Amanda Silberstein, and welcome to my presentation, A Look into Lateralization of Brain Function. So the first time the concept of brain lateralization was introduced to me was in art class in 10th grade. And my teacher showed the class an image similar to this, and she said that people who excel in all things arts-related theater, arts and crafts, painting, etc., were dominated by the right side of their brain, and that people who felt like they excelled more in math, language, fact-oriented things were more governed by the left side of their brain. And this was such a broad statement, and I remember being very confused because I didn't know that different sides of our brain control different functions. I thought that our brain just worked together, worked equally on both sides, and it wasn't until Neuro and our studying of split brain patients and brain lateralization that I was finally able to get some scientific backing to these questions. So I'm looking forward to sharing with you my findings today. So before we begin, I just want to define some important terms because the topic of brain lateralization is large and vast, and I struggled to condense it all and get very specific in this presentation, but I hope I did a good enough job. So here, in my own words, here are some definitions of the most important aspects of my research, and they all relate back to the umbrella idea of brain lateralization, obviously. So we have brain lateralization, corpus callosomy, which is when the connection between the left and right hemispheres is severed, hemispherectomy, which is when one hemisphere is completely removed for medical reasons, and neuroplasticity, which is how function is regained after a hemispherectomy. So to start off, I want to talk about the formative case study, micro-me self-recognition in a split brain patient, and just some common background knowledge to lay out before we get into talking about the study is that the right hemisphere is gifted at recognizing a familiar other. So your brother, your mom, your roommate, etc. Would be the right side of the brain recognizing that person, and the left is gifted at recognizing the self. So looking in the mirror, seeing yourself, picking out yourself in a photograph of a group of people. And in a typical individual, the hemispheres would work together in this processing. So I know when I look at a picture that it's either my roommate is on this side and I'm on this side. So it's a very connected, smooth process. But the reason that this experiment came to be, and the reason that famous psychologist Michael Gazzaniga wanted to do the study on his long-term patient JW, is that JW's corpus callosum, was severed, so there was no communication anymore between his right and left hemispheres. So they were curious what JW would see when he looked at images of either himself or Mike Gazzaniga. So they did this through fusing images of their face together. And when they presented these images to the right side of his brain, JW only could detect Michael Gazzaniga even if the image was fused. And when it was presented to the left side of his brain, he could only detect himself even if the image was fused. And as you can see, there was this wide range of images, but didn't matter how fused, how similar it looked to either one of them. If it was shown to the right hemisphere, it was Michael. If it was shown to the left hemisphere, it was JW. And this is important to highlight because it shows that this is a lateralized brain function that allows us to work and move through life normally, but this is the outcome when the hemispheres connection is severed and they cannot work together. So now we're going to break up into function and talk about language and brain lateralization. And language is regarded to be one of the most lateralized function, and we know it to be primarily controlled by the left hemisphere. And language is a broad function, clearly. There's spoken language and written language, and we're using language all the time. And that's why it's so important. And they're both predominantly handled by the left hemisphere. And for written language, there's a special area called the visual word form area, and this is especially in the left hemisphere. And basically what the visual word form area does is what the image on the right shows you. So if you were to read the word apple, your brain would picture an apple. If you're familiar with the word, if you've seen it before, you will be able to get a clear image in your head of what it means. And this is so important for encoding, reading comprehension, etc. And it shows the active role that the left hemisphere plays in this sort of language task. And this is necessary to understand because in a split brain patient, their right hemisphere does not have access to this left hemisphere process of the visual word form area anymore. So they essentially cannot read because they cannot visualize the words that they see. Next, we're going to talk about another function called spatial attention, and we're also going to bring up atypical brain lateralization. So what is atypical brain lateralization? Atypical brain lateralization is when a function that's usually associated with one hemisphere is controlled by the other hemisphere, or two functions that are controlled by opposite hemispheres are controlled by the same one. So in this case, we're going to look at spatial attention and how occasionally in an atypical brain lateralized individual, it would be controlled by the left hemisphere. So this is a right hemisphere process being controlled by the left hemisphere, and language would also be controlled by the left hemisphere. And when these two opposing functions are controlled by the same hemisphere, lateralization is not as prominent and brain organization is atypical. And there's nothing wrong with these people. This is just how their brains are organized, and this is how they function. And interestingly enough, statistics show that people who have atypical brain lateralization are more likely to be left-handed, which is very interesting. And there's a lot of research on that. And I'm left-handed, so I wonder if my brain is atypically lateralized, but I guess there's no way to find out. Next, we're going to switch gears and talk a little bit about neuroplasticity, which is another broad concept, but it's very important to hemispherectomy and understanding brain lateralization. So, in children who experience severe seizures or have severe seizure disorders like Rasmussen encephalitis, when seizures are happening 3 times a minute and function and quality of life is so depleted, a drastic measure that doctors go to is hemispherectomies, completely removing one hemisphere of a child's brain where these seizures are originating from. And this is very dangerous, but it's shockingly effective, and seizures usually come to a complete halt afterwards. But obviously removing a hemisphere takes out so much function that was lateralized to that one hemisphere. But thanks to neuroplasticity, these functions that were lost can slowly be taught to the remaining hemisphere. So the remaining hemisphere is working in double time and can do this, not perfectly, but can. And that is because the brain is plastic, as neuroplasticity suggests, and nothing is hardwired or rigid, and there's always room for growth. But it's important to note that there is a time limit on neuroplasticity, and this is evident in studies comparing children and adults. It's often not a good idea for an adult to get a hemispherectomy because the brain is really only at its most plastic in childhood before 16, and the sweet spot is really even younger. It's between 2 or 3 years of age. So this is a very delicate, careful process. It's worth it for the people that it can work out for, but it's just a shame that due to the lack of capability of neuroplasticity, older people cannot take advantage of this life-changing method. And this image, I thought, explained it really well. It's essentially neuroplasticity is someone fixing your brain with a wrench like they would fix a car. I think that's what it's trying to mimic in the image. So lastly, we're going to bring it back to the beginning, my art class, and talk about creativity and the lateralization of the medial temporal lobe. So the medial temporal lobe plays a large role in creativity. That is where creativity originates in our brain, and there's part of the medial temporal lobe in both the right and left hemisphere. And it's very important to define that there are 2 types of creativity: novel and useful creativity. So novel creativity you can think of as your primary creative idea. It's if you had no limitations, it's all the ideas that could flow into your brain, no filter, no edit. And useful creativity is taking that long, expansive list of ideas that you had and taking off the chunk that's useful and just using that. Useful creativity, practical, rational ideas. So the novel creativity is controlled by our right hemisphere. It's our primary creative route, and then we pass it to our left hemisphere, which is our secondary creative route. And we need this filter because I can't imagine a world where every creative idea that someone has would be brought into fruition. It sounds chaotic and dangerous. And since we need this filter, both sides are important in creativity. And I thought that that was really important because it's interesting that we regard the right hemisphere as being the only part of our brain capable of creativity, when in reality, both sides play such a huge role. So yeah. Lastly, here are just some quick takeaways before we wrap up. So in almost every study, all of my research, the most important thing that I took away is that brain lateralization is not a black and white concept. There's too much variation, and all individual cases are different. I got to read a lot of case studies with big sample size populations, and there was never 2 individuals with the same lateralization of their brain. There are common trends, but it's interesting to see just how many people are atypical. And moving off of that, I really enjoyed how all different people with all different medical histories can be studied. One study was all on normal people with normal brain lateralization. The next one showed only split brain patients. The next one, only people with hemispherectomies. So I got to learn about a lot of different medical cases relating to the larger topic of brain lateralization. So I really enjoyed that. And lastly, something that's so important because we do talk about neuroplasticity so much in class is that there's a limit on neuroplasticity's effectiveness, and that is used in making medical decisions and deciding whether or not someone would qualify for a hemispherectomy. So I thought that was really interesting and important. So thank you so much for listening. Here are my references. Have a good day. Thank you.